right, we are good to go with Salina Media Connection. So we'll go ahead and get the study session underway. This is the fourth in a series of 5 presentations that are a Live Salina update, which basically means we're updating our housing plan. And I will turn it over to either Mr. Scragg or Ms. Driscoll, whoever is going to be.
I will defer to Ms. Driscoll. She's been leading this charge along with Mr. Schugert.
All right, Ms. Driscoll.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Today we are talking specifically about tools and techniques. You know, Marty's been taking us on a bit of a journey, trying to kind of understand what we're experiencing as a community in regards to housing. Our original Live Salina plan was done in 2016, and since then we've had a lot happen. So the update, we started with meeting 1, updating our demographics, and then looking at how we would start to address our demographics and the need for housing, what some of the challenges we have in Salina are, and what we will need to do to work through those challenges, particularly incentives and the types of incentives that are out there. And that's primarily what we're discussing today, the tools and the techniques used to incentivize housing, particularly the types of housing, different price points, different geography that we're looking for in Salina. So with that, Marty will take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. You guys are gluttons for punishment, so you're in for another one today as we take a little bit of a journey through the murk of programs and a little bit of housing finance. Some of this will seem, if not elementary, at least it's helpful to me to sort of structure things this way. So please bear with me if it seems overly simplistic. It's entirely on my part. So with that, we will start out with the presentation, and as Lauren said, today is Tools and Techniques Day, looking at different devices that you are about to use and that you have within your control, as well as some other things that we can glean from other experiences, and including a little bit of new legislation that's coming up. It's really kind of interesting stuff. So with that, we will, as any good episodic series does, begin with what's happened up until this point, and just starting out with where we ended last week. If you recall, be the next slide, that we talked about the dynamics of markets and about some of what this all means for developers and for programs moving forward. So we know that costs are rising in such a way that in order to build housing that is affordable to a workforce and to a greater slice of the population, we're going to have to build some things that people are not all that used to building. And the kind of comfort level construction of building single family detached houses on 8 to 10,000 square foot lots and even larger just isn't going to produce what we increasingly need. We know in Salina that that values and rents tend to be relatively low, but construction costs don't necessarily follow suit. So that increases gaps. Interestingly enough, there is an initiative that I'll talk about a little bit later that looks like it was actually tailored specifically for Salina. It's actually in the infrastructure bill that's before Congress. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how that might help. Beyond the kind of steady state production, the production that we normally get in housing construction in Salina, there are 2 factors that are coming up and beginning to hit us in the face. One is pent-up demand, because we've been building not just in Salina, but throughout the country for a relatively higher end and not meeting the needs of people who are increasingly entering the housing market. We're seeing this, by the way, manifesting itself in the incredible national shortage of available housing, and just talk to anybody trying to look for a house, and it's a pretty incredible problem that's going on right now, as well as major employment growth. But it's pretty tough for builders who are not used to speculating to build for these things that aren't there. Finally, it's easier for a market to react to employment growth after it's already there, rather than to build in advance and try to finance that inventory. And that also entails risk. On the other hand, sometimes it's too late by the time the jobs are already there and people have begun to settle in other places. So all these factors, as we discussed last time together, entail risk. So as we think about the kinds of programs and ideas that make sense for us, we know that we have some individual imperatives to think about. And this gets down to thinking about what we want to encourage. Is it higher density, new formats, absorbing some of the risk for building new kind of stuff that people are not necessarily used to, building it fast, building it of a large enough scale to mean something, to build rental housing, and certainly to preserve the existing inventory, because we can never build ourselves out of an affordable housing problem solely by new construction. Which then leads us into our conversation today. So our next slide, which would be the last slide from last meeting. Next one, there we go. Is basically, what do we do? How do we put the tools together to address the risk that really tends to discourage housing production or create disincentives for it? How do we get our industries involved? How do we provide more diverse products? How do we deal with the gap, the financing gap that can make it very tough to build at least today's construction costs? So all of these things are going to lead us up to today on April 19th, where we'll talk about programs. And finally, at our next session on May 10th, which gives me a week breather to think, to think about the contours of a strategic program for housing development in Salina moving forward. So now we come to part two, today's tools, and what we are thinking about working with and what's within our control today. So a little bit of a primer here on who the actors are and what these costs mean. And I know people are listening in the general public, so this may be helpful in terms of defining some of these terms. Project cost equals equity plus debt. Project cost is what it takes to build stuff, what it takes to build a certain project. Equity basically means everything that you don't have to borrow. So equity can be cash or hard assets, including things like land, that can be brought to a project, things that you don't have to finance through debt. And there are a variety of sources for equity. They might be the developer. They could be investors who are buying tax credits, for example, or putting cash into a project. We consider public sector grants to be equity. If they're grants, they don't need to be paid back, and therefore they fall into the equity side of the ledger. And it can even be contributions. So there are places where charitable organizations are heavily involved in housing finance, and they put money in at equity and may or may not get it back out at the other end. Equity doesn't mean you lose the money, but equity means it's money that goes into a project that you don't need to borrow. when we think about homeowners equity, equity is what you actually own as opposed to the outstanding mortgage that you're paying off. So so equity is that. Debt is what has to be borrowed to be able to build the project. So so debt can be sourced from financial institutions, as it normally is, through secondary markets like Fannie Mae. So when a bank loans money to you as a home buyer, for example, um, typically that bank will sell that mortgage, doesn't hold it, although in some cases they do, but will sell that mortgage to a secondary market who accumulates all these mortgages and then pays a servicing fee. So Fannie Mae, Federal National Mortgage Association, that we all heard so much about after 2008, is a secondary market, a place. It is a government chartered, but not a government agency, but buys debt basically, and earns interest and supports itself on that, pays back the banks for originating the loans. Debt can be bondholders. So in some projects or in things like RHIDs, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, bonds might be sold, and those bondholders are lending money effectively to a project and are paid back by the operating revenues of the project. Or in the case of many of us who were young homeowners at one time, individuals can hold debt as well. So the most common element of that is by going to your parents and asking for a loan to buy a house. But individuals can also be financiers. So so these different agencies of equity and debt all have expectations, and those expectations are in the next slide. So main expectation of the debt holders, they get paid back with interest. That's what they're primarily interested in, no pun intended. But equity holders have a variety of different ways of gaining a return on their equity, and we touched on some of these in previous weeks. So they may have a cash on cash expectation. In other words, I'm putting my cash into a project. I expect a 6 or 7 or 8% return on my investment on an annual basis on that project that's generated out of cash revenues. That's kind of the simplest and in the world of real estate, not necessarily the most common method of return, but it's there. Tax credits we've already talked about. So in the case of what we call LIHTC, or low income housing tax credit projects, if I put a equity into that project and it's a tax credit project, I get a certain percentage of that equity off my income taxes as a tax credit, basically a direct payment. So as an example, if I am in a project that is that I've put $10,000 into, and I'm getting a 9% annual tax credit on that, that's a small investment for these kinds of projects. I will be able to deduct for 10 years $900 or 9% of that investment off the bottom line of my tax liability. So it's like cash I don't have to pay the government. So it's different from a tax deduction. It's a tax credit that's worth dollar for dollar as opposed to 35% or whatever the deduction rate is. Depreciation is another return on equity. So if I am a part owner of a real estate venture, I can depreciate that over time. That project may actually increase in value, but I can still depreciate it as if it were property. And that's why often people who are involved deeply in property development or ownership don't pay very much in taxes, because there are these various ways that are in the tax code that allow people to reduce their or eliminate their tax liability. Tax losses, if I'm in a project that is on paper losing money, I can deduct that. I sometimes you wonder why there are so many hotels that are getting built, and how they all make it, and they do have to cash flow. But even if they don't for a time, the investors in those projects can write off those tax losses against other incomes. And finally, and very importantly, that property has value when it sells to somebody else. And at that point, and with good luck or a reasonable investment, that property increases in value. So I'm going to get my proportionate share of the equity out of that at the back end. So equity investments in real estate can be very, very rewarding, but not necessarily in the conventional sense of getting like an annual payment back in cash on your investment. There are many things in the tax code, and then the expectation of gain at the end of your engagement in that project that can all make this a very very rewarding venture. And that's important because to a large degree, the amount of rent that you can charge or have to charge is generated by debt. And if these other ways of providing return and cash into a project on the equity side can be realized, it means that you don't necessarily need to charge the people who are renting quite so much. But there are a variety of things that need to be done in order to make the overall project work in terms of other kinds of incentives, often tax driven. So let's see what. Oh yes, okay. So then the other important factor that really creates the problems at the front end are gaps. So there are. This is by no means exhaustive economics course, and I'm not qualified to teach one, but this gives you some idea of the two kinds of two significant kinds of gaps that we need to deal with, and the two most common ones. Number one is the gap between market value and replacement value. So say that it cost me $200,000 to build a house, and the market for that house is only $150,000 because of the overall values in the community or in the neighborhood or so forth. And there's a $50,000 gap between what it's cost me to build that house and what I can sell it for. That does not exactly encourage people to build that house. So that's a gap between market value and replacement value that needs to be filled. The other significant gap is a gap in revenues. And that's really where we come into the rental housing scenario that we talked about during our first week together, where the revenues that are coming into the project through rents and other income are less than the cost of operating and financing that project. So there are three pockets that generally need to be filled. One is O&M, what it basically operations and maintenance, what it basically costs to keep that thing going. The debt service, the amount of money that I as a developer have borrowed to be able to build the project, and the expectations of my equity investors who may or may not want a piece of that typical annual revenue. So there we have some of the issues that on a fundamental basis we have to deal with, and which individual programs and incentives have over the years accumulated to try to deal with that. So let's delve into those a bit. The first program is that I know something about because I've been involved in it is the Rural Housing Incentive District, or RHID. And I know that Salina has not, I thought you had, but has not done one yet, but you have several that are coming up. Basically, what RHIDs are tax increment financing for residential development. So TIF as such in the state of Kansas can't be used for TIF being tax increment financing, which I'll explain for everyone who maybe doesn't know, is a very tried and true technique. And what TIF does is it freezes property taxes at a pre-redevelopment level, and then it allocates the added taxes created by the redevelopment project to fund and repay costs that are related to that redevelopment project or associated with it. So let's say, for example, that I have a piece of land, and that piece of land has a pre-redevelopment value of $50,000. And I'm going to build $1 million project on it. So the tax base is frozen at $50,000 for a certain period of time. And the added taxes from the added $950,000 of value can be used to finance certain eligible development related costs. So our RHID is exactly the same thing, except that it's related to housing. So the RHID, being a variation of tax increment financing, allocates the added taxes created by a housing development project back to debt retirement or to the reimbursement for eligible costs related to the project. So the question then becomes, what are the eligible costs? It includes all taxing jurisdictions, but and I'm not sure that this is in the statute or whether it's just it is a possibility, but you can exclude a certain amount of school tax levies from the RHID. Otherwise, it ties up everybody's taxes who's a property tax jurisdiction. It provides front-end financing, basically in a way like selling revenue bonds. So a developer can put money up front and then be paid back by the added taxes created from the project. That's not an uncommon way to do either TIF or an RHID. So as an example of that, let's say again that I'm the developer and I'm going to loan $1 million to a project to get it going, and in all probability, I will have borrowed that money from my bank. The added taxes created by that project are then used to pay back that $1 million quote loan, and so I have arranged that financing as part of the deal. In Omaha, where I'm from, we have used that over and over and over again for the last 30 years to finance rehabilitation projects in so much of our downtown and inner city neighborhood housing developments have been financed that way. The other way to do it, and this is generally used on bigger deals, is to sell bonds. Bigger deals because it costs extra money to sell bonds because there are financial agents and servicing fees and placement fees and so forth. But if the deal is big enough and beyond the capability, for example, of any one lender, you might sell special revenue bonds. They're not general obligation bonds. In other words, the city does not pledge its credit to pay them back, that are then retired by added taxes, again, the tax increment, or even by special assessments. It's interesting that when RHIDs were created, and I mentioned some personal interest in this because the first city to really used this tool was Dodge City, and is still really the authority on it. And we were involved in that as a result of housing work that we were doing in Dodge City on for the city. And they really have done the most, I think, in the state with the RHID concept. When RHIDs were first created, Salina was not eligible because you couldn't be bigger than 40,000 people to be able to use an RHID. Now it's up to 60,000. So Salina is an eligible RHID community. In addition to that, the sunset for an incentive district was 15 years, and that's now been extended to 25 years. Although you have the ability and the right to create a district for a shorter period of time. You've got a maximum of 25 years for this district to be able to allocate taxes back to it, but you can make it much shorter than that, and can vary that, and that may be something to think about as we think about the future structure and consideration of these districts. Next slide. What can you use an RHID for? Well, you can use it to buy property. You can use it to relocate people. You can use it for site preparation, that is demolition, anything, soils, remediation, anything that's needed to create a developable site. It can be used for infrastructure. So sewers, lift stations, stormwater, streets, lighting, utilities, sidewalks, water distribution, all the stuff that's needed to provide urban services is an eligible use for an RHID. You cannot use it to build new houses. So it's an indirect subsidy. So you can't say, well, I'm going to use an RHID and put this money into new construction. You can't do that physically for the stuff that's coming out of the ground, but it's pretty much good for everything else. And the associated activities have to be within the designated district. So in other words, you can't say, well, we're going to form an RHID district on Schilling Road, and we're going to put the proceeds of that district into North Salina, as an example. It has to be within the boundaries of that designated district. There's a process that has to be gone through to form an RHID. And I won't go into this in great detail, but it's really kind of a three-step process. First, the district has to be defined by the city. That involves doing a needs analysis, a resolution that creates the district, and then state approval through the Department of Commerce of that district. There is a public hearing that has to be held before the district can be formed, and that requires notifications not just of the public, but also of the taxing jurisdiction. So the school district and the county need to be notified. Finally, there is a development plan, much like a redevelopment plan in a tax increment district or redevelopment project, that has to be prepared and approved by the city commission. And interestingly enough, the county and the school district have a veto over that. So it's a really important idea to be working in concert with the other taxing jurisdictions, because they have skin in the game as well. And they have the potential of being able to derail the entire process. So it creates the issue of making sure that, number one, it's really needed from a public policy point of view, and number two, that everybody who's at some financial exposure, that is other governments, are on board with that specific project. So the advantages of an RHID are that, number one, importantly, based on what we talked about last week, it reduces risk. So it reduces the exposure on what I think and many people think are the most speculative parts of a project, and that is the front end costs, putting the stuff in the ground to be able to support the project. it generates development without a direct capital outlay from the city. There's a sacrifice, and that is the added taxes created by that project for a while, but you don't have to put out money in the budget on a capital basis. It does not legally obligate the city. So if the thing goes kablooey, it's not an obligation of the city to bail it out. It requires planning and thoughtful development, which some people think is a disadvantage, but I happen to think as a planner that it's a really good idea to be thoughtful about what you're doing and not just say, "Oh, RHAD, sure, that sounds good. We'll give it to you." So the disadvantages of it are the process, that it requires planning and thoughtful development, but also state approvals and so forth. Obviously, it defers the growth in tax revenue. So if the project wouldn't happen without it, and really needs it to be able to accomplish other development goals in the city, like job attraction, it may be worth that sacrifice, and it may not be a sacrifice at all. But nevertheless, you don't get the immediate tax revenue created by that particular development. It requires the jurisdictions to reach consensus about it, and it's not always well understood by the public. So when you certainly see this in TIF projects, and I suspect in RHID projects as well, that well, they were granted $2 million in a rural housing incentive district. They weren't exactly given $2 million to go and build it. It doesn't. But the nuances of it can be a little bit more difficult to explain. Oh, so that's been a mouthful. I'll stop for air and questions if you have any about it.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the commission?
Just Trent Davis here, and I think I've heard the answer to this before, and I can't remember what it is. If the city is not legally on the hook for the money loan for the RHID, who actually is?
It's a great question. So keeping in mind that these bonds or loans or whatever are paid back by taxes, if the taxes are insufficient to pay back the loan, it is either the lender that it is basically the lender who's on the hook for it. So if you're a bond holder and you bought an RHID bond and the taxes are insufficient to make your payments, you're going to take a loss on that project unless somebody decides to bail the district out, which you're not, as a city, not under any obligation to do. If you're the developer and you've loaned your own money or your bank's money to finance an RHID, then again it's the developer's financial risk or the bank's financial risk, but the city is not is not on the hook in terms of its full faith and credit to make a district that's underperforming whole. However, and this is a big however, you don't want to have a lot of RHIDs going bankrupt, or because it's going to potentially affect your bond rating, even though you're not obligated to do it, or it's going to make it very questionable that you'll be able to use the tool again in the future because the well has in a way been poisoned. So it's not a bad idea to be cautious, but it's also not the taxpayer of Salina's responsibility to make a district whole or to bail it out if it's failed.
What kind of timeline is on the approval processes?
I don't I don't know, and I think it's probably different from place to place. There is in the legislation a specific notice period and a specific period of time that it takes. I would generally figure from reading the legislation that it's probably, assuming everything goes reasonably well and it doesn't take a huge amount of time to prepare the documents, probably about a 4-month process.
Marty, that's about right. What I would add to that in the conversations that we've had with the state and better understanding this process is it's kind of a two-part approach. First, you have to get the district created, and then you have to go through the process of actually figuring out what goes in the district. So the time allotment for asking for the district or getting it created is a resolution being passed by the commission and then being sent to the Department of Commerce. Commerce says typically about 30 days for them to turn that around. But we're hearing that they understand the need for housing in the community. So they're being very diligent about those requests. So we've been given assurances that they would turn them around as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's good information, because that's the one piece that I didn't know is how long it takes. We do for TIF districts in Nebraska, for example, the state has nothing to do with it, so they're just created. How fast the state turns it around is kind of the unknown, and if it's about a month, and that comes out to be about right at 4 months.
And some of the timing depends too, Commissioner Ryan, on the amount of detail and the knowledge that the developer has for the plan that gets created for the district. Because some communities go and create their RHID district, and then it may linger for a while. They've decided that that's where it was going to go, and it may be a few months later or even years later when somebody decides, here's my project, here's what's going to go. And so developing that plan and the things that need to qualify to go in the district are kind of a whole nother piece. So 4 months is optimal, but it can range depending on who's doing it and what's being done.
Now I'm pretty sure that there is a time constraint on the initiator of the district too. So you can't just sit there forever. And they die if they're not acted on.
But there can be a little bit of a gap. You're right. I mean, you can do it for 10 years and let it linger.
Yeah, exactly.
Commissioner Hoppick here, and this may be for staff or this may be for Marty. Because of the timing of all this and not 100% sure if there is going to be an infrastructure bill or dealing with the American Recovery Act, if an RHID is set up, bonds are sold, can those be paid off early? And if so, is there a prepayment penalty?
Absolutely not. I mean, there is no prepayment. Prepayment is what we as public sector lenders love to see. It's a prepayment. You gotta buy them flowers if they pay it ahead of time. Because that means tax revenues flow faster.
Well, I just know sometimes people have bought bonds expecting a certain cash flow on those. That's why I would ask. So in other words, if an RHID was set up and we were able to have other funding come into play, we could use those funds and pay that off.
Potentially, I think it's fair to say potentially. I mean, a question like that, I don't think it happens every day. So I think it's worth a conversation having with Gilmore and Bell. Our bond counsel, to understand that. And I think it's most applicable depending on what the development agreement is for that.
So the really interesting question, and I know the answer, I know the answer in Nebraska, but I don't know the answer in Kansas, is can you be the lender of the money and then pay yourself back? So in other words, let's say that this is not an issue that's come up very often. But let's say you decide you get $1 million in American Rescue Act money, and you say, well, we're going to loan that $1 million to a project, and we're going to grab everybody else's taxes to pay that back. We're going to create an RHID. lend the money ourselves and then reallocate the tax revenues from both us and the other jurisdictions to pay back that loan. Is that a legal thing to do in Kansas? And is that going to be, it's not, it's something that I, as a community development director in Omaha, have done before, but and using block grant money as the front end money, and it'd be basically the same thing. So something to think about. It I would defer to your bond counsel on that one, though.
Any questions from staff? Okay, we'll keep going.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so item number 2 is neighborhood revitalization program, or the NRP. So again, this is something that you have the ability to create, and the NRP is a tax, and I'm sure you've done these because you've got the program already set up. That NRPs are a tax rebate. So in the case of an NRP, and generally people's experiences with NRPs in terms of producing housing have not been as powerful as an RHID. It is a rebate of property tax increases that is attributable to some form of residential improvement. So unlike the RHID, which is front end financing, the rebate is back end financing. I have to make the improvement, start paying taxes on it, and then I can get a certain amount of those taxes refunded to me for a period of time. So they require specific district designation. I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know. And they provide a 50 to 100% rebate for the added taxes for the first 5 years of the rebate period, that then drops to between 25 and 50% for the next 5 years. And the interesting thing about NRPs is that in a designated area, they can apply to a small project. So let's say I live in an eligible area and redo my kitchen for a cost of $30,000, and my property taxes go up as a result of that kitchen remodel. I can apply for that money to be rebated to me for a certain period of time. So it is more effective, really, in terms of removing disincentives for individual projects, and maybe not quite so effective at leveraging large projects. Although it can be very useful, as we saw in our first time together, about the power of reducing that annual outlay of funds to things like rents. So it's not an insignificant thing, but in many cases it's the front end financing and the front end risk that is a bigger deal than the rebate at the back end, albeit useful. I have to have already taken the plunge, and then I can get my taxes rebated that are related to the cost of that improvement. So next slide. So that's those areas that are eligible for improvements in Salina. And again, I'm not telling the commission anything it doesn't already know, but there are 2 levels of areas. The blue areas have the deeper incentive, the green areas, the lesser incentive, and the southeastern and central parts of the city are not eligible for this use of this particular tool. So the advantages of it is that it's an incentive, or really more kind of a disincentive remover, rather than a risk abatement program, because you've already taken the risk. RHIDs attack risk. NRPs can attack an operating gap, or it rewards reinvestment in a property. So as a property owner, if I'm worried about doing a major project in my home because I'm afraid I'm not going to get my money back out of it, or it's going to increase my taxes. It doesn't for a while anyway, and it removes the disincentive to making that investment. It's pretty easy to get these done, much easier than the RHID. And as I mentioned earlier, it applies to projects of all sizes. Easy to get done because these are pre-designated districts already, and you don't have to form a district or go through state approval or any of those processes. The disadvantages are that, again, it requires the improvement to be done before the benefits of it kick in. And it doesn't address the front end risks that really are the biggest kind of immediate issue that we need to worry about right now. But nevertheless, a useful thing that Salina and other cities in Kansas have at its disposal. The third thing that you have in your immediate toolbox are IRBs, or industrial revenue bonds. So IRBs have changed somewhat over the years. What they are actually is a financing pass-through with some distinct tax advantages. So the city can issue an industrial revenue bond to finance a commercial project. Commercial projects also include multifamily residential projects without incurring capital obligations or debts. These are revenue bonds again, and it is the bond holder or lender who holds the risk to it. And the city, and in many cases the county, is there as a issuer of the bonds. They were originally very useful because they provided an income tax exemption by virtue of being municipally issued bonds for economic development projects. And there was a time when whether a bond was taxable or tax exempt was really a big deal, and could involve multiple points on your tax bill. The tax exemption allowed the interest rate on those bonds to be lower. Right now, interest rates on pretty much everything are pretty low, so that delta between a tax exemption and a taxable bond has been reduced. The tax exemptions were curtailed during the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, through the Economic Recovery Tax Act. And so rather than allowing federal income taxes to be exempt on bonds willy-nilly, the government, through an act of Congress, established a cap for tax exemptions, for tax exempt bonds, that a state couldn't exceed, and state had to come up with a method of allocating that tax exemption. That, by the way, happens right now with tax exempt mortgage revenue bonds. There's a ceiling that states have, and they can't issue tax exempt paper beyond that. So for a lot of traditional economic development projects, factories, manufacturers, and so forth, they don't necessarily have the same power as they used to, but they can be a convenient thing. They are placed with the developer's lender or another private placement. So ordinarily, the city does not, although it can, issue these bonds as a public offering. Keep in mind, again, that the city does not have a general obligation to pay back these bonds if there's a default. And probably most importantly right now, the city has the ability, and does, as a matter of policy, offer sales tax exemptions and property tax abatement on IRB finance projects. So the sales tax exemptions on construction materials and so forth, and that is not an inconsiderable subsidy at the front end. And you have the power, although again, not the obligation, to provide property tax abatement on IRB financed projects, presumably even if they're outside of NRP designated areas. So right now, the IRBs are mainly a convenience, and an exemption from certain kinds of taxes by matter of policy. They're not so much the federal tax exemption tool that they were prior to the 1980s. So those are the things that we have. Those are the things we have at our disposal basically right now. Any questions so far?
And one clarification possibly, with industrial revenue bonds, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're directed at commercial activity. And so what we've been advised is for a rental property is something that's going to be held by the owner as a commercial operation. Lease rate apartments would be eligible for IRBs. A subdivision of homes to be constructed, and sold to the occupants wouldn't be eligible for IRBs.
Correct. So, right.
I have a question for staff. I know that Marty said that the neighborhood revitalization programs haven't been as popular. Do we have any sense of how many NRPs that we have outstanding? Any projects? I can think of one since my time on the commission, but there may have been more.
The most recent and probably the most relevant example I can think of is the first phase of the Lee buildings were eligible. In fact, we created a category of projects of exceptional community significance,
Right.
which created a heightened rebate level.
Right.
We do have some builder developers and landlords that are knowledgeable of the program will purchase properties and flip them, but we don't really see a whole lot of activity. And I certainly don't see it as an organized redevelopment effort with the exception of Lee buildings, but Ms. Driscoll may have more specific numbers or recall something that I've overlooked.
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's generally been the experience of Kansas, of cities in Kansas, that they use the RHIDs more than the NRPs. And it's interesting because the NRPs are really also designed for like individual rehab projects, and people either don't know about that or the process is difficult. That's a very legitimate use in terms of rehabilitation and housing conservation, but it's unfortunately little used, and I think it's just because people either don't know about it or don't see how these things apply to them.
Thank you. Any other questions before we head on? Go ahead, Mr. Shuker.
I'm sorry,
Oh,
one question. For this Trent Davis again, for the RHID, could a large employer or groups of employers be the ones to take those bonds? I don't know if they would do it on a investment benefit basis or just as a part of their overall commitment to growing the community and helping their employees out. But I imagine the return on that is not very high.
You're stealing my thunder for the next part of the presentation.
I will pretend like I didn't ask. All right.
Well, not to contradict.
The answer is yes.
So commissioners, not to contradict that conversation possibly, but you may recall that each of the economic development incentives we've done for quite some time have been pay-as-you-go, dating back to the tax increment financing project for the Coles or Lambert's edition. So the premise that staff starts from as we're dealing with developers is we expect pay-as-you-go, meaning we're not issuing bond, we're not incurring debt, whether it's the city's obligation or not. We're just not part of that debt transaction. The expectation is the developer incurs the debt, and then they, are successful as they plan and generate the increment, and then they can apply it back towards the debt that they incurred. So I would encourage you not to get too hung up on the expectation that we have to issue the debt. Now, we could end up in a conversation about comparison of interest rates and whether the city's interest rate is more favorable. And speaking with our financial advisors, they speculated that RHID bonds are as much as 5%. So I don't know that our issuance of RHID bonds would generate a favorable interest rate for the developer anyway. But I'm repeating myself a little bit, but we start our conversations with the expectation that while the tool may be available, it's on a pay-as-you-go basis.
Okay, so tools. So these are things that some of them are they're new and some of them aren't, and this will be a little bit of a sampler of different kinds of things, and hopefully I'll be able to get through them without driving everybody crazy. So let's move on. So in order to try to make sense of it, I have divided the encyclopedia of redevelopment or of housing development tools into three categories. One category deals with production, with things that in one way or another encourage or reduce the risk of the actual physical construction of housing. The second are operational. So these are subsidies at the back end that are related to the operating gap that we might have, that we talked about a little bit earlier. That is filling the shortfall between operating revenues and fixed costs. And finally, resident tools that are really focused on the people who wind up living in the unit after it's built. So these things are related. By the way, this is new stuff. I mean, I just invented this, so so you haven't. It's by no means part of a canned presentation. So, but one thing that our time together has really helped my thinking too is just sort of systematizing things, and it's I really do appreciate. Hopefully, it's been helpful to you, but it's been helpful to me too. So let's.
One question, just, this is for rental property only, I'm assuming?
It's really for anything.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So when we talk about residents, it's both owners and renters, and as you'll see, places in between. So production tools, that first category, is again focused on housing production. Its primary purpose is to reduce obstacles and risk to building stuff. It fills economic gaps, that is the gap between the replacement and market value of a project. And in most cases, it provides direct monetary incentives for desired action, so that it's aimed at giving people positive encouragement through the goodwill is really nice, and civic virtue is very important. But in capital markets, making a profit on stuff's a pretty good thing to do too. And so it usually provides a monetary incentive for people doing what we want them to do. There are some exceptions to that, however. So operational tools are related primarily to reducing the annual costs of owning or operating housing, or filling gaps between operating costs and revenues. Resident tools are focused on the people who are actually the occupants of the housing, whether they're owners or renters. Generally, resident tools will reduce the percent of income that's directed to housing. So that's the direct measure of affordability. And typically the measure that we typically use is a family or a household should ideally pay no more than 30% of their household income for housing costs. That's kind of the federal standard. It also provides monetary incentives for desired actions, not unlike production tools. So there are cases where well, McPherson is an example of this, where a home buyer is actually paid something to buy a home or to move to town. It builds equity. That is, it helps people accumulate wealth, and as reflected by the equity that they own in their home or their housing unit. So these are all a little bit different. They can be mixed and matched, and they're interrelated, but they can be put into one, for simplicity and clarity, they can be put into one category or another. So let's start with production tools. So I'll confuse things even more by saying that they fit into a number of different subcategories. So tax-based tools, these are tools that use some aspect of taxation to create producer incentives or risk abatement, are RHIDs, which are based on directing taxes you're going to pay anyway on the project into front end costs for that district. So RHIDs or TIFs are tax-based production tools. They don't involve an outlay of money at the front end by the municipality. The LIHTC program, or low income housing tax credit, was created a number of years ago and provides an investment tax credit to equity investors in low and moderate income projects. So the size of the tax credit, as we, I think, mentioned before, can be either 4% or 9%, depending upon the income groups that are targeted and the percentage of the units that are available or that are held available for those income groups. It has been very much responsible for a lot of the multifamily development that we have experienced over the last 10 or 15 years. Not all of it, but a lot of it, because it provides a very attractive option for the equity investor. On the other
Marty?
hand, yes.
What I want to quick add about LIHTC, great tool, but for those who are unfamiliar with it, it's a program through the state. So the city can support an applicant, but it's actually the developer
Correct.
who makes that application. And the state essentially only rolls out so many of them. We kind of say in the office, like, who's in line next? KHRC, or Kansas Housing Resource Corporation, who runs this program, basically has a rule that if you've already got a LIHTC in process in a community, you can't have more than one. So if you've got a project that's either in the middle of a LIHTC or wrapping one up, you've got something usually waiting in the wings. There's another developer, and if you can remember, we've had developers come to us and ask for a letter of support in their application process. But that tool is wonderful, but we are kind of out of the control loop as far as how many of those are being granted at one time.
Yeah, a great point. Remember that the LIHTC program is a federal program. So as a result of that, the federal government only allocates a certain amount of LIHTC funding to each state. So the state is otherwise there wouldn't be any federal income taxes anymore. So the state is limited by its federal allocation, and so the individual states then come up with a competitive process to assess who gets a LIHTC project and who doesn't, and what the priority for them are.
And Mike Scragg here. My understanding is the 9% are more coveted and harder to come by. The 4% are not as enticing to the developer just from a financial standpoint, but they are easier to come by or not as competitive. And then Mr. Sugart mentioned that both of them carry with them income qualifications. So depending on the potential resident, that can also be an impact.
Yeah. So the 4% can be a mixed income project. The 9% can't be.
Right.
And
this is something. Oh, I'm sorry,
Absolutely.
Marty. I was just going to say, this is something that's come up in our demographics when we looked at and started updating the Live Salina plan, is when you look at the amount of affordable available rental housing in the community, we actually have a challenge that a lot of our units are LIHTC units, and they use the median income to set rent. So if you're making more than, I think it's 42,000 a year, or even the high 30,000s, then you can't qualify for those units. So, and it does look at overall households, but still, that is one of our challenges. Is it's that middle ground income rate that we've had a hard time
Yeah.
getting units available for.
Yeah.
Is that 30 or 40,000? Is that per household or per individual?
Household.
That's that median income. It does start to build up over households. So the number of people you have deems the number of rooms that you'd need. So there's a little wiggle room to go a little bit higher over that individual's median income level. I can let Marty keep talking and quick Google that number.
Yeah, but I mean, the median income is graduated somewhat by family size. And, but the difference between the 9% and the 4% credit is that 9% credit cannot be a mixed income project. It's all got to be a low income project. Low incomes, by the way, are not necessarily people in poverty. But the other a couple of other interesting kickers with LIHTC projects is that when you have to, if your project does not attract the requisite number of low income households, you've got to keep those units available and vacant for a low income household. You can't rent it to somebody else at market rate. Number two is that the tax credits run for 10 years, but the low income occupancy lasts for 15 years. And if you violate the rules of LIHTC, that is, start charging market rate rents or having market rate individuals in units, those tax credits can be recaptured retroactively, which the investors in those credits really don't like very much. If you've taken, you can imagine if you've taken $10,000 tax credit for 10 years, and then in year 13 there's a violation and you're told you have to pay that all back with interest. That is not a very happy camper who's hit with that. So there are significant strings attached to it. It's been the other interesting problem, and this has occurred in rural markets, is that sometimes the LIHTC units are priced well above the ambient rents in that community. And it's perfectly legal, but if you're charging $600 a month on a LIHTC project, which would make good economic sense in Salina, and you're a small town that's got where people think $350 a month's a lot of rent, that project still seems pretty high income and doesn't rent up very well. So it's a good program for bigger communities and has gotten a lot of stuff built, but it doesn't always work for everybody. Okay, so now comes a new program that doesn't exist yet, but it's really kind of based on LIHTC, and this is one that could potentially have, if it winds up becoming law, a lot of appeal on the ownership side for Salina. And this is called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. I got the H wrong there, but it's homes and not housing. Yeah, same difference. But so what this is has a $2 billion national allocation in the American Jobs Act, which is the current infrastructure bill. And what it does is it provides a tax credit to fill the gap between the market value of a house and the production or replacement value of a house or of a housing unit. So let's say this goes back to my earlier example of a house that costs $200,000 to build. Say for example that I'm a community development corporation or a CHODO, and we're building housing. It's costing us $200,000 to build that house, but we know that we can only sell them for $150,000 because of the market in that neighborhood. So there's a production gap. There's an economic gap of $50,000 there. just like the LIHTC program provides tax credits to benefit low and moderate income development, the NIHA program or NHIA program would provide a tax credit to fill that gap. So now if I'm an equity investor in a CHOTO or that's taking a $50,000 loss, I can take that money off of my tax bill as a credit up to 35% of the cost of the unit. So this would wind up, if it went into effect, wind up getting used much the same way as the LIHTC is, by selling tax credits. But the beauty of it is that it was clearly done by people who knew what they were talking about, which I find to be refreshing, and it applies it applies specifically to things like infill development in a neighborhood like North Salina. So it is a very I think a very powerful potential tool for getting affordable owner-occupied housing built, and is something that I really hope becomes law, because it is really speaking to a significant unmet need in our housing environment. So remember that NHIA, and it is a good thing, and really has great applications for small cities and even rural communities. So it's one of the few programs that wasn't done for big cities. It's very interesting. So other tax-based tools are, we've already talked about the LIHTC, but historic tax credits that are used for projects like I suspect the Lee buildings used the historic tax credit, that provide for certain kinds of equity investors who have property, passive tax losses, a significant tax credit to restore or rehabilitate or adaptively reused National Register eligible properties following the Secretary of the Interior's rehabilitation standards. But a good program for existing units. And then there is, of course, the ever popular depreciation, which is generally affordable to everybody. So those are all the tax-based tools I could think of offhand. There are development tools that involve direct payments or subsidies or incentives. So for example, you can and do, for certain kinds of projects, reduce or even forgive or eliminate permit costs, which may be a small item, or they may not be, but they are a benefit, a goodie that can be given to developers of things that you want to see happen. There are direct production subsidies, so that involves the actual allocation of cash to a project. That can take the form of grants or subordinated loans. Typically, if there's a public sector loan, it will be subordinated to private debt. So the bank or the private lender is a first mortgage holder, and the public sector is a subordinated loan holder. Payment can be deferred so that it becomes a payment that takes place, that gets repaid perhaps with interest at the sale of property or transfer of title. Real estate acquisition, buying or accumulating land and then conveying that land at a write-down. The old urban renewal tool is a development tool. So it's basically the public entity is taking the burden of putting the deal together and of selling or giving the land to a developer for a public purpose. Development entities, which are nonprofit agencies that can attract charitable funding, equity investment, have a special allocation of funds to them. for development. So development entities can be nonprofit. So these are like CHODOs, Community Housing Development Organization, of which Salina has one, or CDCs, Community Development Corporations, which are basically the same thing, but don't have the same kind of board, community-based board requirements. CHODOs, incidentally, have a 10% special allocation of LIHTC funding, and under the NHIA would also have a 10% reservation for NHIA funded projects. So they have a kind of an advanced position for some of these tax credit programs. Employer assisted housing is a development tool. So that's where we come into the question that we just heard. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then finally, another interesting development tool is acquisition, rehab, and resale, by which a developer, this can be considered to be nonprofit flipping of houses. So a nonprofit agency can buy houses at relatively low cost, rehab those, and then resell them to a buyer. And in my city, Omaha, we've been very successful with that program with nonprofits. So there are infrastructure-based tools. So RHIDs are an example of those. There are special assessments by which the public sector is providing the front-end financing. There's an idea that I've talked about before called an infrastructure bank, where the public shares in the risk or finances infrastructure at the front end as a loan, and then at a sale takes out its respective portion of that loan. So to explain what that means, let's say that that there's a house that costs $200,000, and an infrastructure bank, which is basically a public sector agency or entity, has financed $20,000 of that through the advanced construction of infrastructure. And then that house sells in 5 years for $250,000. The concept would be that the proportionate share of that then comes out of the resale proceeds. So that if it was 20,000 out of 200,000 or 10%, if that house sells for $250,000, the city or the infrastructure bank gets back $25,000 or 10% of those sale proceeds, basically deferring that investment but getting it back at the back end. And loan guarantees by which the cost of the cost of building infrastructure and building the development, which is a front end cost, is guaranteed by some entity, and so that the lender will make that loan. And then finally, there are legislative tools. These are not necessarily positive things, but they are various kinds of requirements. So there are zoning incentives that make it easier to do certain kinds of projects, like higher density projects or innovative development. So for example, a lot of cities are beginning to make auxiliary dwelling units, second units that can be developed on a lot, as legal uses in single family districts. And there are other cities that are actually making single family districts, zoning districts alone, that only allow single family detached houses, no longer part of their zoning ordinances. So I'm not recommending you do that, but it's a tool that places are using to increase density. And related legislative tool are mandates and minimum requirements. That is, if you build multifamily development a certain percentage of that has to be available by mandate to low and moderate income or workforce prices. So those are the producer tools. I wonder if I could just go offline for about a minute. It's a little bio break that would be helpful, and if you'll indulge me, I will be right back.
No, that works, Marty.
Yes.
Okay.
What I can add is, I believe Commissioner Hoppick asked about the average median income number. So the AMI, or average median income, is usually what HUD works with. And our current AMI is $48,079. So that is the average median income for our community. And to be low income, you have to make you can't make more than 80% of that, which is $38,463 a year. To be very low is 50% of AMI, which is $24,039 a year. And then there is actually a category which is considered extremely low income, which is 30% of AMI. That's $14,423 a year. There is some change in there, but that just kind of gives you an idea of how that AMI works. And we can see that in certain grants. Generally, we see the same numbers and calculations, but sometimes there's a slight shift in number of people in the household and how much money they're adding to the table, or number of children are in the household, and that can change how money is distributed. But that usually varies from program to program.
And so, Lauren, are these numbers for a household or for an individual, and more, they go up, for the greater number of people in the household, or?
That is the median household income.
Okay.
So those numbers are based on a household.
Okay. And how large, does it specify how large of a household? Is that 2? Is that 4? Is that, or?
Typically what I've read from HUD is it's based on 4 people. I will tell you the census shows our average family size is 2.63.
Okay.
But I think HUD typically refers to average median household income as 4 individuals.
Thank you.
And like I said, that's usually a starter place. And what we see is in grants where this is involved, HUD has the base calculated number, and then how they're breaking that out by per person or number of children or various income sources changes based on that grant. But AMI, or average median income, or household income, is usually where it all starts.
Gotcha.
I think Marty is back.
All right.
Oh, and he needs to be unmuted.
That's what I get for drinking a Diet Coke before a long presentation. Okay. So back to the So this is this is the NHI program that I was promoting here before. Not a paid non-political advertisement, by the way, but this is the area of Salina that would be eligible under that program. So it is a lot of the city, as you can see, although still not the southeastern area. Employer-assisted housing has some really interesting possibilities from a number of different perspectives. So from a producer perspective, this is a project that's a very interesting one in a small town in Iowa called Sioux Center. And Sioux Center is a town of about 4,000 or 5,000 people in northwestern Iowa, and is very heavily industrialized and is a very kind of wealthy town. The industries and kind of players in town a number of years ago formed something called the Sioux Center Land Development Corporation. So this was a for-profit development corporation, not intended to lose money, but everybody bought stock in it. And so it had a fair amount of capital, and its goal was to build a golf course subdivision, which it eventually did. And so it had assets from that, and the industries decided that their next problem using that capital was to build workforce housing, build houses, affordable single-family owner-occupied houses for their workers. So they devoted that capital into home building, developed a subdivision that now has about 70 houses in it, which is a lot for a town of that size. And because they were sharing the risk and using their own capital, they were able to achieve some significant economy of scale. So they could build 5 or 10 of these at a shot, be able to build not exactly mass development, but achieve economies as a result of that, and then revolve that money as they sold these houses to their workers. So they're relatively modest. They're not fancy, but they're eminently livable, and they've been very successful at it. And now they're using this capital pool that they have, as you can see in this article, to build some multifamily as well, because that's really where increasingly the need is. So this kind of employer-assisted housing, I think, is something that really should be part of our strategy for Salina, and it needn't be grant-based. It could be, but by doing things like buying bonds, providing risk pools, construction financing, even a development company can become very active in terms of building housing for future employees and staff members. And I think it is a program that can be both rewarding to everybody and can be very helpful in terms of recruitment efforts and in terms of taking full advantage of economic development. So you can count on this being part of what we'll be talking about at our next time together. It really does have some significant possibilities for Salina. Operational tools. These deal with the operations side of the fence. So rebates and tax abatements, tax rebates like the NRP fit squarely within this, because these are dollars that are off the operating side of the ledger, taxes that you get back, and so they don't have to be paid by residents or owners or tenants. Projects, the city or utilities could reduce or waive fees of various sorts, like water and sewer connection fees for selected projects, all of which has to be structured with specific criteria so that everybody doesn't think that they're entitled to those. And also a kind of basic assumption that there's not going to be equal treatment, because there's some projects that have gaps and there's a public purpose in filling those gaps. Finance incentives. So this gets into the kind of cross-pollination of production and operational tools, by which a production tool, which reduces the amount of debt and adds to the amount of equity, reduces the cost of financing, which in turn reduces operating gaps. So those kinds of financing incentives can be helpful. Costs or breaks on utilities. A program that has been successful in Minnesota has been the 4D program, which is an energy conservation grant and tax credit program that provides tax credits for energy conservation improvements, and that are associated with grants for different kinds of energy production, like alternative energy. So these are all things that in one way or another reduce the operating costs of a unit, and really largely relate to rental development, perhaps more than owner-occupied development. And finally, we come to resident-oriented tools, and these have both rental and ownership elements. On the rental side, the Section 8 program, which all of you know about, is a rent subsidy program that that is clearly a resident assisted or resident based incentive tool, although it helps to fill housing units. This is another place where employer assistance to property owners or renters can enter into the picture as well, in terms of providing incentives for people to own or rent in the city. Indirect tax credits are indirect rental assistance that they reduce rents to the residents because they basically push the cost of debt off to, or the cost of finance off to another entity, namely the federal government. And finally, on this list, the concept of shared equity or crown, which are rent to own projects, can be an interesting one. So in a rent to own project, again, often developed by a CHOTO or a CDC, a unit is built as a rental unit. It may even be built as a LIHTC project, which Omaha's Holy Name Housing Corporation has used extensively. The renter gets a certain amount of home ownership training, and a certain amount of their rent payment is escrowed to fund a future down payment, which is then converted to equity. If it's a LIHTC, it can't be the same house, but into a similar house that they then have a down payment to buy. So it's a transitional program that gets people building equity in a community or a neighborhood, which can then be converted to purchase a home. From an ownership perspective, there are incentive programs that are direct, or payments that are basically paying somebody something to buy a house. They might also be down payment assistance, which I didn't list as such here, but that's also an incentive payment. Subordinated loans, home and the home program and the community development block grant program are often structured in a way that they provide a second deferred or forgivable mortgage to reduce the cost of debt to the homeowner. The house is built, but the homeowner gets a break by virtue of a very low interest or zero interest subordinated loan. Lenders consortiums are interesting bodies because they can both provide construction financing and can provide loans on a public interest basis to people who are not quite bankable, who are potentially creditworthy but have something in their past that makes them look like bad risks on paper. So, for example, in Omaha, and I think I'll mention this in a minute, we have an entity called the Omaha 100 Corporation that started in the 1990s, and it started as a lenders consortium primarily to finance projects that were larger projects developed by community development corporations. They would provide the construction financing for those through a consortium of local banks, and they have now converted more and more to providing and holding paper for for worthy potential owner occupants who are not quite credit worthy, who fall into a higher risk pool. So so they can take a number of different roles. Loan guarantees, the classical one being the old the good old FHA program, established during the 1930s, which is essentially a guarantee to a originating lender that the federal government, if need be, will pay off a mortgage if there's a default. And finally, again, employer assistance, employer-based incentives to people who are buying, who are employees who are buying houses in a neighborhood. So specifically, our Sioux Center example is both a production technique, but it's also a resident-based technique by lowering the cost of those houses to workers. So here you see a description of the Crown or rent-to-own program and some of the product that they've produced. This is in Omaha is a very long-standing community development corporation that was organized by a Catholic parish as a program to really repopulate their neighborhood and to reverse blight in it. And they have been probably in this state, Nebraska, and probably throughout the Midwest region, one of the most successful CDCs or nonprofit community development corporations that we have in terms of effectiveness, viability, number of units, and diversity of projects. They've been a very very good agency.
Marty, can I ask, where did their original startup money come from?
Holy Names?
Yes.
Contributions. It's interesting. It started out as two parish priests who neither one of whom are priests anymore. I've lost track of them. One of them became a housing consultant, by the way. Then the next and long-standing executive director of it was Sister Marilyn Ross, a nun, who's just an incredible person. She retired a few years ago, and their initial funding came from a combination of private contributions in the city.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And their initial work was actually acquisition, rehab, and resale. So they were buying wrecked houses on terrible houses in really bad shape in the parish area, and they put together a construction crew to rehabilitate the houses, and then they would resell those. And that's really how they built their program. They built the viability of their program. And then eventually got capitalized through like the Lenders Consortium, the city, and private contributions. And they continue to do, they're a 501c3, so they continue to do and be supported by both their own revenues and by an annual contributions campaign. But they have built hundreds of units, several big subdivisions, significant rental development, the rent to own stuff, senior housing. They are a pretty big builder as far as community development corporations go. St. Louis University. This is not a small agency, but if you know SLU and know the neighborhood that they were in, it was not a very good neighborhood, and they set about from a variety of reasons, both from the point of view of their religious mission, their civic mission, and also just to be able to make the school marketable to the students they wanted to attract, have really done a lot to rebuild the neighborhood. And it's been largely through employer-assisted housing. So they provide information on housing, but they've gotten a lot of stuff built. And their incentives have been better interest rates and reduced closing costs on mortgages, They've worked with financial institutions on refinancing, and they give forgivable loans to staff buying homes like this townhouse project in their surrounding neighborhood. So they felt that that neighborhood revitalization was a really critical element of what they needed to do to attract faculty, and that they wanted to build a community around the campus, and have done a really great job of it. It's a pretty remarkable effort in St. Louis, which has a lot of other troubles, but the SLU neighborhood's not one of them. So now, as we think about all of this stuff and think about preparing for May 10th, we'd like you to think about, and maybe even in our remaining time here, to discuss your suggestions and thoughts about a strategic housing program for Salina. And the questions to think about, because we'll be talking to you in this sort of lecture mode, but also we want to really get into conversation as we move toward the real design of a program. What should we be focusing on? How should we be using our resources, whatever they might be? First of all, what are they? And secondly, how do we evaluate projects? How do we tell somebody yes and somebody else no? How do we balance new development needs and rehabilitation or housing conservation needs? What should our structure for producing housing look like? Should we reinforce the CHODO? Do we work primarily through the private sector? Do we have some combination of the two? How are lenders and employers involved? What kinds of resources do we have to work with realistically? So, we know we're getting some money through the American Rescue Act. Is housing a desirable use for some of these funds? If so, how much? Some cities actually allocate funding on a regular basis to infrastructure and housing development. What can we afford to do if anything? So these are really questions to think about. We'll certainly be thinking about them, but to think about for our kind of critical discussion next time on May 10th, when we try to put all this stuff together.
Marty, I do have one follow-up question, if I could, and
Yes, Mayor.
been trying to figure out how exactly to express this. So forgive me as I walk through it. Since bigger economies of scale are necessary for a lot of these projects that we're looking at, we're obviously looking at greenfield development and possible annexations. And in the past, when we go ahead and we get infrastructure put into those new neighborhoods or those new developments, at what point do we transition from having that land be categorized as agricultural use and categorized as like an R1 or R2 or R3? When does that transition ideally take place? Because there's different taxing values, obviously.
Yes, that is a really interesting question. Normally, rezoning a rezoning from, say, an ag zone to a residential zone, to an R zone, will take place when the project is actually planned and put together and ready to go. And I know that there's that one of the things is that the owner of the land who's paying less property tax on agricultural land than they would on urban land wants to. It's an interesting thing, because you number one, you want to have the highest certainty that you're going to get your property, your project approved. So you want that to be in advance of your investing in plans and development costs and so forth. But on the other hand, you want to defer the higher taxes that come with being classified as urban land as long as possible. So it's a real question mark. I would say the time to do it, depending upon the nature of the project, is at a conceptual level. So that is, you've got enough information, put together enough information that you know you've got a picture to look at, and to get approval of a rezoning from ag to that permitted use at that point. But you haven't gone to the process of doing all the construction documents and all the other processing that's necessary. In other words, you try to hit the balance point, whereby you might be 6 months or 9 months out from breaking ground on the project. You haven't incurred all the development costs yet, which you don't want to do without the assurance of the rezoning. But the period of time in which you're zoned urban as opposed to agricultural might actually fall into the lag time that it takes the assessor to reassess the property anyway.
Gotcha. So like, but once the infrastructure has gone in the streets,
Then it's urban. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're deeply committed by that time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the commission? We're
Well,
at lunch today. Well,
Yeah.
hang on. Let me,
Well-
I noticed that we do have a couple of members of the public in the audience. If you have a question for Mr. Schugert on the housing plan or any suggestions for us, you're more than welcome to approach the podium and share those with us. And if not, that's fine too. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Doesn't look like I have any takers on this end, so.
You have to wake them up.
No, I appreciate it, and I appreciate staff also putting together the previous presentations so that we'll have the luxury of familiarizing ourselves, refamiliarizing ourselves with the previous presentations, and we'll be up to speed for the final one. Is there anything that you need from us? What do you want to hear from us? What do you need from us at this point?
Your thoughts about those questions.
Mayor Hodges, there are a few people from the members of the public online. If we want to give them
Okay.
an opportunity. If anybody in the public online wants to speak now, if you would raise your hand, digital hand there, we can call you and recognize you to speak. And I don't see any hands.
Okay.
So Marty, would you say it's safe to say that in preparation for the next meeting, the commissioners thinking about those last questions would be helpful? We're probably going to put together some framework and things like that, but that's really
Yes,
what we're zeroing in
That's
on
really,
now.
yeah, absolutely. That your thoughts, and you might even want to formalize that a little bit in terms of getting some notes to us, bullet points, things that you're thinking about before we really start to put this thing together.
And
That's
that
exactly
meeting
what
is
I
going to
was-
be, I'm
That's
sorry,
exactly
Madam
what I was going to say. You've laid out these questions for us and everything. Is this something that we should think about in the next few days and get
Yes.
something to Ms. Driscoll and try to articulate a little bit about where we're coming from so that you can help us find some common ground and some common themes in there?
Exactly.
yes.
Okay, so, all right, so we've got our homework. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you as always for your courtesy and your patience. These have been hopefully good for you and certainly interesting for me too.
And Lauren, I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you
No.
have something that you wanted to share?
No, I was just going to say that next meeting date is May 10th.
May
Thank you for
10th.
the opportunity, Madam
May
Mayor.
10th.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Marty. Appreciate it. We'll see
Thanks,
you on May
thanks.
10th.
Be well,
And
everyone.
Mayor, we have another strategic planning session of the 5th, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
That's correct,
It's
yeah.
May 5th.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would say it would be a pretty good time to collect our thoughts.
Absolutely. Great suggestion. All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And we will resume at 4. All right, we just got the all clear sign. Welcome to the Monday, April 19th, 2021 Salina City Commission meeting. Before I call the meeting to order, I would like to confirm that the Kansas Open Meeting Act required notice has been properly provided.
Yes.
Thank you very much. With that, we'll proceed with roll call.
Mayor Hodges,
Here.
Commissioner Davis,
Here.
Commissioner Franz, Commissioner Hoppick,
Here.
Commissioner Ryan.
Here. Mayor, if I may interject a point of information for you. I'm preparing for a medical procedure tomorrow, and I may have to step away from the camera here from time to time, but I wanted you to be aware that my hearing devices allow me to hear everything that's being said, and
All right.
I'll be here for the votes.
All right, thank you very much, Commissioner Ryan, for letting us know that. With that, we will proceed to the Pledge of Allegiance and followed by a moment of silence. So if you're able, please rise and join us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right, we'll proceed to awards and proclamations.
Item 3.1, the month of April 2021 as Child Abuse Prevention Month in the city of Salina. Laura Kermer, Community Engagement Coordinator with CAPS of Salina, will read the proclamation.
Whereas we are living in a time when disclosures of sexual abuse and harassment are becoming mainstream, child sexual abuse still lives in secrecy and shame. In Kansas, reports of abuse have increased by 64.97% over the last 20 years, which indicates people are recognizing the signs. And whereas children have a right to be safe and to be provided an opportunity to thrive, learn, and grow. And whereas child abuse and neglect can be prevented by supporting and strengthening Kansas's families, thus preventing the far-reaching effects of maltreatment, providing the opportunity for children to develop healthy, trusting family bonds, and consequently building the foundations of communities. And whereas by providing safe, stable, and nurturing relationships for our children, free of violence, abuse, and neglect, we can ensure that Kansas's children will grow to their full potential as the next generation of leaders, helping to secure the future of this state and nation. And whereas there were 898 cases of child abuse and neglect investigated by the Department of Children and Families in Saline County alone last year. And whereas child advocacy and parenting services provides both prevention and intervention programs designed to reduce risk factors associated with child abuse and neglect, while focusing on educating parents and empowering children. And whereas in 2020, the global pandemic brought unique challenges, removing children from their regular interaction of safe, caring adults with increased isolation and in many cases, increased stress by changing roles and unemployment. CAPS remained operational for the entire year and conducted forensic interviews for 127 child victims of abuse or neglect and or witnesses to a violent crime. Those victims also received professional advocacy, a medical exam, and care by trained sexual assault nurse examiner on the sexual assault response team, referral to trauma-focused mental health services, and follow-up reports. These services are delivered through a multidisciplinary collaboration between City of Salina and Saline County Law Enforcement, CAPS, Salina Regional Health Center, Department of Children and Families, Child Protective Custody, Saline County Attorney's Office, Central Kansas Mental Health Center, and private therapists. And whereas Child Advocacy and Parenting Services, Inc. began as a child abuse prevention coalition in 1978, the agency has a vision of a place where every child is safe, healthy, and strong. CAPS hopes to shine a light on abuse to create awareness and increase support through the following public events. Go Blue Salina, businesses encouraging employees to wear blue jeans and or royal blue can collect funds for CAPS and spread awareness by taking photos of employees to show their blue support. Each participant will get a sticker to wear showing they believe every child should be safe and loved. A pinwheel parade, families are spreading awareness with pinwheel coloring pages displayed in their windows for all to see as they enjoy the beauty of spring. And Pinwheels for Prevention Challenge, a roaming pinwheel garden that is spread via donations from individuals who wish to send the garden to others to show they believe in creating spaces where every child is safe, healthy, and strong. Did I read the last? Therefore, I, Mayor Melissa Hodges, City of Salina, Saline County, Kansas, do hereby proclaim April 2021 as Child Abuse Prevention Month and encourage our citizens to lift up a child's voice.
Thank you very much. How do people find out more information about the Pinwheel Parade and Pinwheels for Prevention and Go Blue Salina? Do you have a place where they can access some more information on that?
Yes, they can visit our website, capsofsalina.org, or they
Okay.
can visit our Facebook page at Caps of Salina.
Awesome. Thank you. Or do you all have any other events planned for the month?
Not for this month.
Okay, great. Well, every child should be safe and loved. So thank you for doing your part to promote that. If you'd like to come forward, I've got your signed proclamation. Thank you very much.
Item 3.2, the month of April 2021 is Fair Housing Month in the City of Salina. Yvonne Montoya, Community Relations Division Supervisor, will read the proclamation.
Good afternoon, everyone. This proclamation of the City of Salina, whereas the fight for fair housing has been more than 50 years in the making since the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1964, which enunciates a national policy of fair housing for all who live in the United States. And whereas our country has progressively identified the protected classes to which we all belong, and the act protects against discrimination not only based on race, color, religion, and national origin, but in 1974 recognized gender, and in 1988 recognized disability and familial status as protected classes as well. And whereas economic stability, community health, and human relations in all communities are improved by diversity and integration. And whereas the principle of fair housing is not only national law and policy, but is enforced locally under Chapter 13 of Salina City Ordinance, and the City of Salina is committed to the mission and intent of Congress to provide equal housing opportunities for all citizens. And whereas we recognize and celebrate the strides that have been made to remove barriers to fair housing, and we recognize that acts of housing discrimination are repugnant to a common sense of decency and fairness, and that we as a city and nation still have much work to do. Now, therefore, I, Melissa Rose Hodges, Mayor of the City of Salina, do hereby proclaim the month of April 2021 as Fair Housing Month. Whereas the people of Salina are encouraged to learn more about their rights and responsibilities under the Fair Housing Act, as well as the Kansas Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, as we collectively fight housing discrimination within our community. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the City of Salina, Kansas to be affixed this 19th day of April 2021 by the Honorable Mayor, City of Salina, Melissa Rose Hodges.
Thank you very much, Ms. Montoya. I don't think that we've had the opportunity to meet you yet. So welcome to your new position.
Thank you very much.
Do you have any events
We
planned?
do.
Because I think I can think of one, but I'll let you share
Yes.
that.
Well, we have two announcements. The first one is to commemorate National Fair Housing Month and the 53rd anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. The City of Salina Community Relations Division will hold their annual Fair Housing Seminar on Friday, April 30th from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. via Zoom. The purpose of the seminar is to educate tenants, landlords, property managers, lenders, and all other interested parties about their rights and responsibilities under the Fair Housing Act. There is no cost for this event, and registration can be completed by going to the city's website, and you'll find a link that will take you to the registration process to register so that you can attend the webinar seminar via Zoom.
Fantastic.
And the second is a new program. The City of Salina Community Relations Division has been awarded nearly $3.1 million to assist Salinans in preventing eviction or regain housing. So in collaboration with the Catholic Charities of Northern Kansas, we will be providing Salinans struggling to cover rent and utility payments due to the COVID-19 pandemic could qualify for up to 6 months of emergency assistance. Salina residents can apply for assistance through the COVID-19 Housing and Rental Assistance Program administered through a partnership between the City of Salina Community Relations Division and Catholic Charities. To apply, Salina tenants should complete the online inquiry on the Catholic Charities of Northern Kansas on their website. There will be a link where they can apply online. They can also contact Catholic Charities in Northern Kansas, or if they need any further information, they can contact the Community Relations Division office.
That's incredible news. Thank you very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. If you'd like to come forward to get your signed proclamation. Thank you very much.
Item 3.3, the week of April 18th through the 24th, 2021, as National Volunteer Week in the City of Salina. Susan Eberwine, Salina Arts and Humanities Program Assistant, will read the proclamation.
Hi, thank you for letting us do this. I am Susan Eberwine. I have been with the city for a couple of years now, and this year I've been asked to lead our volunteer program with Rosa de la Cruz. So we're both going to read this for you.
All right, well, as she just mentioned, I am Rosa de la Cruz, Administrative Assistant of the Smoky Hill Museum, and I've been in this position since 2017.
Whereas National Volunteer Week was established by presidential proclamation in 1974 to recognize and promote the important role volunteers play in creating healthy communities, and is being celebrated April 18th through the 24th, 2021. And
whereas to encourage an environment in which volunteers can flourish, the City of Salina has adopted the goal of continuing a program that promotes community organizations and encourages volunteerism. And
whereas our city government could not function without volunteers who serve on our boards, commissions, task force, and committees, as these volunteers help shape the policies that keep our city moving forward, and their impact can be felt throughout the community. And
whereas the Smoky Hill River Festival relies on 2,000 volunteers to keep the event welcoming and affordable, and the Smoky Hill Museum regular benefits from more than 100 volunteers annually, who provide more than 25,000 in positive economic impact to the city of Salina. And
Whereas more than 60 million people volunteer about 8 billion hours annually in America, make an economic impact of $300 billion, and
whereas there are thousands of volunteers in our community who give their time and effort to help others through their church, community organizations, service clubs, school, hospitals, charitable organizations, and other worthy endeavors. And
whereas volunteering can help reduce stress, provide a sense of purpose, increase brain function, strengthen self-confidence, combat depression, teach new professional skills, and provide an opportunity to meet new people and build community.
now, therefore, be it resolved that I, Melissa Rose Hodges, Mayor, do hereby proclaim April 18th through the 24th, 2021 as a National Volunteer Week in Salina, Kansas. I call upon our citizens to celebrate and promote the positive impact that volunteers make in our city, state, and nation, and to encourage greater participation by taking action to share your time and talent in our community and beyond.
Thank you. Does Salina Arts and Humanities have anything special going on for Volunteer Week?
We do. Before I mention that, I would like to mention that this weekend during the Spring Spruce Up, there were 265 volunteers who served our community. Their combined volunteer hours were 922 and a half hours, removing playground equipment, gutted a kitchen, cleared out a basement, painted 5 porches, built a porch, assembled gardening kits, cleaned up numerous landscaping projects, scraped and painted houses, cleaned trash receptacles, and picked up trash at Lakewood Park along the river and along the North Ohio overpass. The cleanup resulted in 2 large roll-offs, 1 trash truck, 4 dumpsters, and 24 bags of trash.
Wow. Wow.
So we would like to thank the many individual volunteers that donated their time, as well as KWU football and volleyball teams, Salina Heights Christian Church Youth Group, KU nursing and medical students, 4-H, Eagle Technologies, Salina Rescue Mission Leadership Team, and the First Covenant Church. As far as our celebration for this week, in honor of National Volunteer Week, we are posting social media, focusing on the role our volunteers play, and acknowledging the volunteers that serve on the Arts and Humanities Commission and the Community and Art and Design boards. In summary, we would like to encourage all city departments and the commission to advocate for volunteers and to recognize them.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the best things about living in this community is how selflessly people give of their time and their talents to help others and to make this a better place to live. So thank you so much for recognizing that. I've got your signed proclamation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Before we go on to Citizens Forum, it's become a regular time to get an update on the COVID situation in Salina. So I'll look to Mike Scragg.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. As you know, these numbers are as of last Friday, and they're in comparison to the Friday prior, so week over week numbers. For April 16th, there were 38 new cases compared to 19 the week prior. There were 52 active cases compared to 51. There were 5,978 individuals recovered compared to 5,941. And there were 3 hospitalizations, which is the same number as the week prior. And total deaths have remained at 108 for the last 4 weeks.
That's great news. Thank you very much. With that, we will proceed to Citizens Forum. Citizens Forum is an opportunity for any member of the community to speak on any item that's not on today's agenda. So if you would like to speak, I'd ask you to step up to the podium. You will have 3 minutes, and please keep your mask in place while you're speaking.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Denise Ward. I live here in Salina. I come before you today to once again voice my opposition to the City of Salina imposing a mask mandate that businesses are required to enforce. Eating and drinking establishments are restricted in how we do business with this mandate. The mandate does include an exception for individuals who are seated at a restaurant or other establishment that provides food or beverage service while they are either eating or drinking, because we know you cannot eat through a mask, and no sane adult is going to remove a mask, take a bite, a drink, put it back. The mandate then goes on to state that individuals can be without a mask in these establishments, provided they maintain a 6-foot distance between individuals, not including individuals who reside together or are seated together with only infrequent or incidental moments of proximity. This part of the mandate limits my business from a capacity of 90 to a capacity of 30. And I am not the only bar or restaurant who is limited in this manner. Many of us have had to turn away customers, not because they're not wearing a mask to enter, but because of the 6-foot requirement. We can only accommodate a portion of what we could under normal circumstances. We have customers who are aggrieved because they see empty tables but cannot be seated or sit with their group because of table distance limits. On March 24th, Governor Kelly signed into law 2021 Senate Bill 40 of the Kansas Emergency Management Act. Senate Bill 40 gives citizens at all levels a quick and ready recourse to file an action in district court if any disaster order closes their business, restricts their business, limits their business, restricts their movement, or shuts down religious or other civic institutions. These actions, also known as a grievance, must be heard by the courts within 72 hours, and if no decision is made within 7 days, the citizen wins. These cases must be analyzed by the courts using strict constitutional scrutiny. A few weeks ago, when the city attorney said that Senate Bill 40 did not apply to orders issued by the city, he was wrong. Senate Bill 40 applies to all levels of government, and I have verified this with 2 members of the Kansas House of Representatives, which included the majority leader of the House. I have also been provided with a copy of Administrative Order 2021 RL 32, Emergency Rules of Procedure for Hearings under 2021 Senate Bill 40, issued by Marla Lucker, Chief Justice of the Kansas Supreme Court. These emergency rules are written with the understanding that some parties challenging government acts may not be represented by an attorney, and the rules are crafted to help parties complete and deliver their petitions. The order includes template forms to assist us in filing our petition for action, and the form specifically has a box to check for a local unit of government action issued during a state of local emergency. And I have copies of the form if anyone would like to see it, or if anyone is aggrieved, they may have one to file. So in conclusion, I am giving you the opportunity to remove this mandate immediately and let us get back to business as it should be, or consider this a notice that we shall begin using the tools that were given to us by our elected state representatives to preserve our liberties. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ward, would it be possible for you to leave copies with staff so
I
that,
sure can.
thank you so much. Appreciate it. Is there anyone else?
Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Kelly Bush, and a resident of Saline County. I reside in the outskirts of this area, but I also work and shop in Salina, mostly shop. I'm here to let you know I'm agreed with the City of Salina mask mandate. 2021 Senate Bill 40 allows citizens who are agreed with mandates put in place due to any disaster order by any level of government to file an action in district court. It is my intention to file such an action should the mask mandate remain in place. Currently, based upon records and things that have just been spoken before, we're not under a great emergency with COVID. based upon the number of hospital cases and also the county's removal of the mask mandate, which says a lot in itself. I'm kind of getting tired of having to limit the number of people I invite to a dinner at a restaurant based upon the social distancing restrictions and everything else. I can't have the number of people I want because, as Denise has said, she's had to turn people away. I also believe it's time to quit penalizing businesses and people who frequent these businesses in such a manner. If people need a mask, let them decide. I do and wear it when needed. I've also been vaccinated and has had many other Saline County residents. Let's get over this and move on with our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bush.
Hi, my name is Rachel Davis, and I actually live in Lincoln County. I operate a business here, and I've from this area all my life. And it's been very difficult with staffing to staff because they can't make the kind of money they need to make with the restrictions on the tables. Therefore, I lose staff because they can't make the money they need to pay their bills. I'm aggrieved with the limitations that the city mask mandate places in our industry. And for a year now, we've been operating at reduced capacities due to social distancing rules. The state of Kansas and Saline County have now removed our limitations, yet the city of Salina continues to keep them in place with no clear end in sight, besides the promise to revisit the issue. Revisiting the issue doesn't give us an end date. Therefore, it's my intention to file a grievance in district court as allowed by 2021 Senate Bill 40, should the mandate remain in force. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Davis.
Dalton, City of Salina. Last week and this week, how can you run a city council meeting? I thought you're legally supposed to have an odd number, so there is no highs, or the mayor does not vote. But I do believe that you guys need to revisit making a mayor an elected official, not just give it to another city commissioner next year. I think it should be voted on by the people. And instead of having everybody live up in the hill or out south, why don't we split this? Why don't you split it like in districts or whatever you want to call them? Because it's ridiculous that there's an elite group running this town. And it's also ridiculous that you bring the mask law up last week, knowing that you two would vote no to it. And now you want to wait till the end of May. I see everybody that files against the city winning, and I see the city losing a bunch of money for him to protect you because of you two.
Thank you, Mr. McDowell.
Norman Mantle, Saline County. This is in the public newspaper. Do you really want to take the COVID-19 shot? You need to watch the video, Shot in the Dark, with Dr. Sherry Tenpenny on YouTube. That vaccine has been proven to not be effective as we hoped it would be. People are still getting this virus after they've had shots. So I would ask you again to watch Shot in the Dark by Dr. Sherry Tenpenny on YouTube.
Thank you, Mr. Mantle. And I would just note that no matter what vaccine you get for any particular illness, the efficacy rate is never 100. And I believe that these vaccinations have an efficacy rate of about 90 to 95%. So at any rate, that's something to keep in mind. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
Brian Frazier, City of Salina, 512 South 8th. I am in support of the mask mandate. Thank you for voting yes, because masks not only protect me, but it protects those folks that are vulnerable. And that's what we have to look at. I empathize with those businesses that are struggling because no one wants to see businesses struggle. But we also have to take care of each other. And if it's a little inconvenience right now, it's a lot better than the inconvenience that could happen if you do get seriously ill. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frazier.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Chad Farber here in Salina. First of all, I'd like to say our thoughts and prayers are with Commissioner Franz, and we pray for a speedy recovery for Commissioner Franz.
Thank you.
I've heard several people today mention Senate Bill 40, and the word that keeps coming up is the word aggrieved. So I took I used my phone. I know I'm not supposed to do that in here, but I looked up the dictionary definition there, and the word aggrieved means pained, afflicted, or civilly or politically oppressed. And as you can hear from several people who have already come up and spoken to you, they are feeling civilly and politically oppressed, I think is the biggest part of that. And in reference to Mr. Wood, I think last week mentioned this, the May 1st date and how they could file grievances against the city and different things like that. You're hearing today that that wording is already in Senate Bill 40. And the warning that I would give to the city, like we did to the county, is this could cost the city money once these grievances are filed in district court. The process is that it has to be heard within 3 days and a decision within 7 days. So you're going to see immediate reaction from these who have already stated they're going to file a grievance against that. As far as the mask mandate goes, we all know it's irrelevant. We all know that it is not helping. Texas and Mississippi have dropped their mask mandates, as has Kansas, by the way. But cases continue to drop in Texas and Mississippi. Dr. Fauci was asked about that. He said, I can't explain it. I don't understand why. The problem is that masks are not the number one tool to fight this virus. And the citizens know what they should do. This edict that you guys have put out, and I appreciate Mr. Hoppick, the way he put it last week, has fulfilled its purpose. The curve has been flattened. Some would argue that the curve is decreasing now as opposed to going up. Hospitalizations, we are nowhere near maxed out with our hospitals, and it's time to let go of this mandate. Citizens have been caused, law-abiding citizens have been caused to disregard this ordinance of the city because it violates their decision for their health. And I think it's a bad precedent for the city commission, a governing board, to set where you determine health decisions for the citizens of a city. I think that's a very bad precedent to put into place. I will not encourage, like Maxine Waters has done over the last couple of days, I will not encourage citizens to burn buildings or loot stores, etc. But I will encourage today, Salina, stand up against the government overreach of this mask mandate ordinance. Stand up for your freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Farber. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? And it doesn't need to be on masks. It can be on anything. Are there any participants online, Mr. Wood, that have raised their hand? If you're online, give a wave or wave your virtual hand, and we can recognize you and get you unmuted.
I don't see any at this time, Mayor Hodges.
All right, thank you very much. And I do have the deepest sympathy for the business owners that are struggling through all the impacts that COVID had made on us. I would like to note that we have had our first lawsuit related to Senate Bill 40 filed, and there was a hearing on Friday, and the result of that was that the case was dismissed. Now, I know that each one of you has your own individual set of circumstances, but just at this point, we are prepared to address those as they come. And at this point, our present plan of action is to revisit this. And I don't have my calendar in front of me. Was that May
24th?
May 24th, or upon the return of Commissioner France? And I think that that's going to be the plan. So in absence of that, that's where things stand. But I do want to thank you for coming down here and for sharing how this has impacted you. And anyway, thanks for your attendance today. With that, we will move on to the consent agenda. Is there any item that a commissioner would like to remove from the consent agenda?
I would ask that we remove 6.2, please.
Okay. Anything else?
No.
All right. And I'm sorry, I totally preempted our new clerk. Sorry about that.
Item 6.1, approve the minutes of April 12, 2021. Item 6.3, approve change order number 2 for the Markley Magnolia Sewer System Improvements Project number 08-2713, Kansas Water Pollution Control Revolving Fund. Item 6.4, award the bid for project number 21007, 2021 Brick Street Rehab to Bryant and Bryant Construction, Inc. of Halstead, Kansas, in the amount of $104,595.50, with a $5,229.78 construction contingency, for a total project authorization not to exceed $109,825.28, and authorize the city manager to execute a contract with Bryant and Bryant Construction, Inc. of Halstead, Kansas.
Thank you. Do we have a motion to approve the consent agenda, item 6.1, 6.3, and 6.4?
Mayor, Commissioner Ryan here. I'll move to approve those items on the consent agenda.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve consent agenda items 6.1, 6.3, and 6.4. Could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick,
Aye.
Commissioner Ryan,
Aye.
Mayor Hodges.
Aye, and that motion passes 4-0, and we will return to item 6.2.
Item 6.2, authorize the city manager to execute a 3-year agreement with Fox Lawn and Landscape LLC for City of Salina mowing services in the amount of $97,873.
Thank you. Mr. Teutsch?
Ms. Joyce, thank you very much. Just had a couple questions. When I was comparing the bids, it's kind of that old saying, if it looks too good to be true, maybe it is. And when I saw that Fox Lawn and Landscaping was less than half of the other two, it kind of threw up a red flag. So
Sure.
Can I ask what our bid was last year and who the prior contract was with?
The last 2 contracts were with Fox Lawn and Landscape. I compared the elements of the previous contract with the current proposal for those areas that matched up. There was a difference of 4 locations. So from the old contract to the new contract, we've added locations. And the total difference in price was just over $4,000. In and of itself, that would be a 9% increase, except those 4 locations make up about $3,600 of that $4,000. So in effect, the difference between the old contract, the last 3-year contract, and the current proposed contract is right around 1%. I don't know if that answers your question.
So basically,
It's increased by 1%.
Okay.
And to follow up on that, then as far as monitoring and everything, we were satisfied with the service we've received, obviously, from Fox landscaping in the past?
The short answer is yes, and I would say it this way. This company has had the last two contracts. They've had it for 6 years now. I was fortunate enough to be here the 6 years prior, and I would tell you that any company who does this work is going to have issues simply because the number of locations, the other things that can impact the performance of the contract that are out of control of the contractor, such as weather conditions. And I would say that regardless of the contractor performing the work, it requires our supervisors to ensure that they're monitoring the areas. But in terms of his performance, we found him to be extraordinarily responsive. Something that we're doing on this contract from a recommendation by the city manager is we are actually assigning priorities to where we would like for him to apply remedy first if weather conditions or something else causes us to be delayed. So we will not only have a general priority list, which is we want the medians, then the arterial row, then residentials, then the collector streets, and then ponds in that order. But each of the zones will be prioritized by specific location. And assuming that we award this contract, then we will get with Dan Fox and we'll present those priorities to him. In the past contracts, he's worked exclusively with the street superintendent. This time we're adding zones that will add additional city managers designees. But as long as those designees are proactive with their areas, then I believe that this contractor will be as responsive and responsible as he has been for the last 6 years.
Well, it makes me feel much better knowing that that Mr. Fox and his company have done this in the past, and not to question his company. It was just the pricing that had me taken back, which I'm ecstatic about. But and also, I've never heard a negative comment about his company, and I want to make that aware also. So, unless there's any other questions,
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Toyd.
yeah, thank you.
Is there any comment from the public? Not, I will bring it back.
So I've actually been in this industry and I know more about it. My recommendation, Fox is decent. It is way too much to give just to one company. Wichita had the same issue. And now they've split it up into zones and and I believe it would be better to not give it to one company. And Fox has some history that I'm not going to get into. But when I seen that price, I thought the same as what Commissioner Hoppick thought. Way too cheap. Because to do something to do all those, you're going to have over $100,000 just in equipment alone.
Thank you.
Commissioners, as a clarification, we did solicit competitive requests for proposals. It was divided into 4 zones. The bidders had the opportunity to bid selected zones or all zones, and it turns out that Fox Lawn and Landscape was the low bidder on all 4 zones.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Scragg. But that will bring it back to the commission for further discussion or action.
And knowing that city staff is aware of our concerns and will be monitoring the job, I would move to approve authorizing the city manager to execute a 3-year agreement with Fox Lawn and Landscape LLC for the city of Salina mowing services in the amount of $97,873 with an annual cost of living adjustment not to exceed 3%, and add new mowing locations as necessary to properly maintain city areas of responsibility.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to authorize the city manager to execute a 3-year agreement with Fox Lawn and Landscaping LLC. Could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick,
Aye.
Commissioner Ryan,
Aye.
Mayor Hodges.
Aye, that motion passes 4-0, which will bring us to item 7.1.
Item 7.1, authorize the city manager to execute a Fourth Amendment to the transferee agreement with Salina Educational Automotive Museum of America, Inc.
All right, Ms. Tasker.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. Martha Tasker, Director of Utilities. And going to change things around here and start with the last page of my staff report, and which is Exhibit A1, waterline relocation work. Give you a chance to get to that photo because it'll help you understand as we talk forward. But basically, there's an existing 12-inch water main that was installed in 1923, and it's located under the existing north portion of the Salina Educational Automotive Museum of America, or the SEMA building, and also under the railroad right-of-way. And if you've driven down 4th Street, you'll notice that the railroad is very close to the east face of the building in tight quarters. But abandonment of this portion of the 1923 water line is necessary to avoid any costly repairs to the SEMA building and the railroad tracks in the event of a water main break in the future. I think you probably all saw the street out front when the 12-inch water main broke there. It can take out a large area. 2 options were evaluated to relocate the water line. Each option included abandoning the existing 1923 water line under the existing north portion of the building in the right-of-way. The first option that we started down the road with was to install a steel sleeve with the water line under the railroad right-of-way in the general location of where the new building addition was going to be added, or over the parking lot, which allowed us to install a steel sleeve under the new building and install the pipe in it. And in the lieu of a water main break, the building would be protected. We worked with the railroad several passes. Ultimately, we got a plan approved, but there was enough requirements that it made it very, very, very costly. And so we went back to talk with Mr. Pestinger and his representatives about the overall cost of the project, and determined maybe it made sense that the portion under the building would be dealt with by the SEMA owners, and out in 4th Street and in the right-of-way would be a city cost. So the second option we looked at was to install a new water line in the alley west of the building from Iron Avenue to Walnut Street. That we developed a bid cost of $175,650. And we ultimately compared that back to the city's share of the cost for the work in the railroad right-of-way and 4th Street of $150,000. In talking with the SEMA representatives, they felt that it was in their best interest to be able to move forward quicker with the project if they did not have to deal with the railroad and deal with building a sleeve and piping under their building. So as a result of that, kind of going back in time, the city had entered into a transfer agreement with Salina 2020 and SEMA. And that same type of agreement was used for other projects such as Homewood Suites, the Alley, and Old Chicago. The attached Fourth Amendment allows SEMA to construct the new 12-inch water line in the alley, continue on with the work in their building, and make the connections. And from that, the city would reimburse them $150,000, and that would be funded from the Utility Reserve Fund. And this is not uncommon. The utility relocation costs for Homewood Suites and the alley was funded through the Utilities Department at roughly $225,000. And then the Salina Field House was completed by the Utility Department funds at a cost of about $725,000. Staff has identified the standard slate of options. Option 1, authorize the city manager to execute the Fourth Amendment, authorize the execution with amendments, or postpone or vote to deny. Staff recommends option 1. Be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Tasker?
Where does the current water line run? I know where the one's coming through the building, but where is the current water line? Is it in 4th Street?
It runs up from the south in 4th Street. I don't know if you can follow it on that tiny map. And then it crosses under the railroad, under the building slab, then back down a portion of the alley to Iron.
So
Up
will,
4th Street, cross the railroad, then down the alley.
so will this water line replace that water line that's currently being used under 4th Street?
It will not replace the entire line, just the north portion of it. The south portion will remain in place, have a fire hydrant at the end, and ultimately, when we design the Friends of the River improvement in that area, we'll adjust that water main and connect it on at the appropriate location.
Okay.
There just wasn't enough space to try to go to the north, and also many of the buildings on 5th Street are connected in the alley to that existing water line down the alley. So we looked at numerous options, and this is kind of where we ended up with the best option for us in the future for maintenance and protecting the building and the railroad.
Personally, I like this better. I would think a water line running down 4th Street with the railroad where it's at could cause some significant issues down the road if we
That it sure can.
had to deal with the railroad. So,
Right.
Okay.
So it didn't hurt my feelings to move it into the alley. It's a lot easier to maintain. And if you ever work in the railroad right away, it takes a lot of effort to get it done from their inspections and so on. So didn't really want to make any plans to put it down 4th Street until we get the river renewal completed and see what that really means and make sense at the end.
Any other questions for Ms. Tasker?
Nope.
I see that the applicant is here, or a representative for the applicant. I don't know if you want to speak, Mr. Pestinger. It's certainly not necessary unless you'd like. Okay, thank you. Is there anyone here from the public who would like to speak on this item? Anyone online who would like to? No. All right. Well, then I will bring it back to the commission for further discussion or action.
Mayor, I move that we authorize the city manager to execute a 4th amendment to the transferee agreement with Salina Educational Automotive Museum of America Incorporated.
second,
A second.
We have a motion and a second to authorize the city manager to execute a 4th amendment to the transferee agreement with Salina Educational Automotive Museum of America, Inc. Could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick,
aye.
Commissioner Ryan,
Aye.
Mayor Hodges.
Aye. That motion passes 4-0. Item 7.2.
Item 7.2, first reading of ordinance number 21-11057, authorizing the execution of a loan agreement between the city of Salina, Kansas and the state of Kansas for the purpose of financing improvements to the wastewater treatment plant.
All right, Ms. Tasker.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. Martha Tasker, Director of Utilities. The improvements to meet the nutrient removal at the wastewater treatment plant are required by our current wastewater discharge permit. And the intent is for it to be financed by a low-interest loan with the state of Kansas that's administered by KDHE. The loan amount is $31.5 million, and we have I think, a wonderful interest rate of 1.3%. And first semi-annual payment is due in 2023, and the final payment's due in 2042. It's a 20-year payout. The annual payment is approximately 1.8 million, and that's included in our water and wastewater rate projections. We analyze those water and wastewater rates annually, and that's basically to ensure that we meet all of our obligations, including our $5 million target fund balance. In addition, the utility reserve fund has a balance of $10 million, and out of that, we propose to spend $7 million on replacement of 30-year-old equipment at the wastewater treatment plant. These equipment costs are in addition to the improvements that we're making in the loan agreement for nutrient removal. We didn't include any equipment costs in our original plans and had been just monitoring and holding on to our funds to be prepared for this project when we get to this point. We're currently completing a basis of design report that will define what we'll do for the nutrient removal and make us a list of equipment that we need to replace that we can be sure is going to be in play for the next 20 years with the treatment plant upgrade. So we haven't quite finished that. Should be about the 1st of May, and then we'll be presenting that to the KDHE. And then once we get their approval, we'll be back to present it to the city commission and give you an idea of the big picture for the wastewater plant improvements. With that, standard slate of options: approve the ordinance with amendments, could postpone. This one's unique. You could approve the ordinance on first reading and have some amendments at the time of the second reading, or you could vote to deny. Staff recommends option 1. This time, glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Tasker. Any questions?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. The only question I had is in regard to any federal funding that we may be so lucky to receive, whether that's through the American Rescue Plan or a new infrastructure plan. I saw that it is a possibility if we were to choose to direct resources to a piece of infrastructure like this, that prepayment is an option if we decided to go that route. I mean, I know we have way more infrastructure needs than we could ever hope to receive in funding, but I was just curious as to whether or not if this was one of the items that qualified that we could exercise that option if we chose.
Prepayment is an option. In fact, we've done it on one of the other loans for the water distribution system. And this probably isn't the one I'd prepay on. I might prepay
Since
on
it's-
the South Water Treatment Plant that
Yeah.
has a 2.43% interest rate, but
There you go. There you go.
it's an option.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Are there any comments or questions from the public? And I don't think that we have any participants online, so I'll bring it back to the commission for further discussion or action.
Mayor, move approval on first reading of ordinance number 21-11057, authorizing the execution of a loan agreement between the city of Salina, Kansas and the state of Kansas for the purpose of financing improvements to the wastewater treatment plant.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve on first reading ordinance number 21-11057. Could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick,
Aye.
Commissioner Ryan,
Aye.
Mayor Hodges.
Aye, that motion passes 4-0. We don't have any development business today. Are there any items that a commissioner would like to bring up under other business?
Nope.
No? All right, well then I would accept a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0. We'll see you here.